The living room of our suburban Boston home was a picture-perfect scene of holiday cheer. Twinkling lights adorned the Christmas tree in the corner, casting a warm glow over the gathering of my husband's family. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill I felt in my heart. The scent of cinnamon and pine hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of mulled wine that my mother-in-law, Evelyn, insisted on serving every year. I sat on the edge of the plush sofa, my husband Tom beside me, as his relatives exchanged gifts and laughter. The boisterous conversation flowed around me, but I felt like an outsider, as I had for the past 5 years of our marriage. Evelyn, the self-appointed matriarch of the family, held court from her favorite armchair, her hawk-like gaze missing nothing. "Sarah, dear," Evelyn's voice cut through the chatter, dripping with false sweetness, "you're awfully quiet tonight. Cat got your tongue?" She laughed, a sound like tinkling glass that set my teeth on edge. I forced a smile, meeting her eyes. "Just enjoying the festivities, Evelyn." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Well, don't enjoy them too much. Someone has to clean up afterward, and we all know who that'll be." The jab was delivered with a smile, but the intent was clear. I felt Tom stiffen beside me, and for a moment, I hoped he might defend me. Instead, he chuckled and raised his glass. "Mom's got a point, Sarah. You do have a talent for tidying up." The room erupted in laughter, and I fought to keep my expression neutral. This was how it always went, little digs and backhanded compliments, all delivered with a smile and a wink. I'd learned early on that protesting only made things worse, so I'd adopted a policy of silent endurance. As the gift-giving continued, I watched as Tom's siblings and their spouses opened thoughtful, expensive presents. Each gift seemed carefully chosen to reflect the recipient's interests or needs. When it came time for Tom to open his gift from his parents, I wasn't surprised to see a set of high-end golf clubs. He'd been hinting about wanting new ones for months. Finally, it was my turn. Evelyn handed me a box wrapped in shimmering red and gold paper, a sly smile playing on her lips. "I picked this out especially for you, Sarah. I do hope you'll appreciate it." The room fell silent as I carefully unwrapped the gift, my fingers trembling slightly. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me. As I lifted the lid of the white box inside, my heart sank. Folded neatly within was a maid's uniform. Black fabric with white trim, complete with a frilly apron and a little cap. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The silence in the room was deafening. Then Evelyn's voice broke through, laden with mock concern. "Well, nothing wrong with setting the bar low. Now you might finally serve us properly. You know, earn your keep." She laughed, and the sound was echoed by the rest of the family. I looked up, meeting Tom's eyes, silently pleading for him to say something, anything, to defend me. But he just leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Come on, Sarah, don't act so ungrateful. It's more than you deserve. Without me, you'd have nothing. In fact," he gestured toward the maid outfit, "that actually suits you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd endured years of subtle put-downs and not-so-subtle criticisms, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. The uniform in my hands suddenly felt heavy, weighted down with years of accumulated insults and belittlement. With hands that shook only slightly, I carefully folded the uniform and placed it back in the box. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. "Excuse me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the continued laughter. As I walked out of the room, I could hear Evelyn's voice behind me. "Oh, don't mind her. She's always been overly sensitive. She'll get over it." I made my way to the entryway, grabbing my coat from the hook. As I shrugged it on, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me looked pale and drawn, her eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. For a moment, I barely recognized her. The sound of approaching footsteps made me turn. Tom stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his tone condescending. "I need some air," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He rolled his eyes. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. It was just a joke. You're embarrassing me in front of my family." I stared at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. This man, who had once promised to love and cherish me, now stood before me, more concerned with his family's amusement than my feelings. In that moment, something inside me shifted. "I'm sorry you're embarrassed," I said quietly, reaching for the door handle. "But I can't stay here right now." Tom's face darkened. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back tonight. I'm tired of your theatrics." I paused, my hand on the doorknob. For a split second, I considered giving in, apologizing, smoothing things over as I had done countless times before. But the memory of the maid's uniform, of the laughter, of years of small cruelties, steeled my resolve. Without another word, I opened the door and stepped out into the cold December night. The icy air hit me like a slap, but it was refreshing after the stifling atmosphere inside. I could hear Tom calling after me, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief, but I didn't turn back. As I walked down the driveway, snow crunching under my feet, I heard the front door open again. Evelyn's voice carried through the still night air. "Don't worry, she'll come crawling back. She always does. Don't be long, dear." Tom's mocking tone followed. "Dinner won't serve itself." Their laughter faded as I reached my car, parked at the end of the driveway. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to unlock the door and slide into the driver's seat. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Where would I go? What would I do? I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't go back into that house, couldn't face another moment of mockery and disdain. As I started the engine, I caught sight of the house in my rearview mirror. It stood there, warm and inviting from the outside, its windows glowing with cheerful light. But I knew the truth that lay behind that facade, the cruelty, the constant belittlement, the slow erosion of my self-worth. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the house that had never truly been a home. As I drove through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, Christmas lights twinkling on houses and in shop windows, I felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, I was making a decision for myself, taking a step, however uncertain, towards something different. I had no idea what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't be going back. Not tonight, not ever. The maid's uniform, that cruel joke of a gift, had been the last straw. But in a way, it was also a gift, the gift of clarity. It had shown me, in stark relief, exactly what my husband and his family thought of me. And in doing so, it had given me the strength to walk away. As I drove into the night, leaving behind the life I had known, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them on my own terms. The woman who had walked out of that house was not the same one who had entered it earlier that evening. She was stronger, more determined, and finally free. As I stepped out into the biting cold of the Boston winter night, the stark contrast between the warmth I'd left behind and the chill that now enveloped me was jarring. The crunch of snow beneath my feet seemed to echo in the quiet street, each step taking me further away from the life I'd known. The insults and mocking laughter still rang in my ears, a cacophony of cruelty that spurred me onward. I walked briskly, my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The streets were nearly empty, most people tucked away in their homes, celebrating the holiday with loved ones. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, on Christmas Eve, walking away from what should have been my family. As I reached my car, I paused, my hand on the door handle. The weight of what I was doing suddenly hit me. Was I really going to leave? Just like that? Years of conditioning, of being told I was nothing without them, made me hesitate. I could almost hear Evelyn's voice in my head, sneering at my weakness, telling me I'd be back. But then I remembered the maid's uniform, folded neatly in that pristine white box. I remembered the laughter, the mockery, the years of subtle and not so subtle put-downs. I remembered Tom's face, not defending me, but joining in on the joke. The humiliation and anger I felt in that moment gave me the strength to open the car door and slide into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I saw the front door of the house open. Tom stood there, backlit by the warm glow from inside. For a moment, my heart leapt. Was he coming to apologize? To ask me to come back? But then I heard his voice, carried on the cold night air. "Don't worry, she'll come crawling back," he called, presumably to Evelyn or one of his siblings. "She always does. Don't be long, dear." Their laughter floated out into the night, sharp and mocking. It was the final push I needed. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the house that had never truly been a home. As I drove through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, Christmas lights twinkling on houses and in shop windows, I felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, I was making a decision for myself, taking a step, however uncertain, towards something different. I had no real destination in mind. I just knew I needed to get away, to put some distance between myself and the toxic environment I'd left behind. As I drove, my mind raced. Where would I go? What would I do? I had some money saved up in a personal account, not much, but enough to get by for a little while. But beyond that, I had no plan. The realization should have terrified me. For years, I'd been told I couldn't survive on my own, that I needed Tom and his family. But strangely, as I drove further and further away from them, I felt a sense of calm settling over me. It was as if a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. I found myself driving towards downtown Boston, the city lights growing brighter as I approached. The streets here were busier, late-night revelers and last-minute shoppers still out and about. I felt anonymous among them, just another face in the crowd. It was oddly comforting. As I stopped at a red light, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me looked different somehow. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed. She looked alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. I barely recognized her as myself. The light turned green, and I continued on, no real destination in mind. I drove past familiar landmarks, Fenway Park, silent and dark in the winter night, the public garden, its trees bare but still beautiful, the gleaming towers of the financial district. Places I'd seen 100 times before, but somehow they looked different now. Everything looked different. Eventually, I found myself on the outskirts of the city, in an area I didn't know well. The buildings here were older, a bit run down. Neon signs advertised cheap motels and all-night diners. It wasn't the kind of place I'd normally frequent, but tonight, it felt right. Anonymous. A place where no one knew me, where I could disappear for a while. I pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The Starlight Inn, it proclaimed in faded letters. It wasn't much to look at, but it was away from everything, and everyone, I knew. For tonight, it would do. As I parked the car, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I turned it to silent when I left the house, not wanting to hear it. Now, I pulled it out, steeling myself for what I might see. The screen was lit up with notifications. Missed calls from Tom. Text messages, growing increasingly angry and demanding. "Where are you? Stop being childish and come home. You're embarrassing me. If you don't come back right now, don't bother coming back at all." The last message made me pause. Don't bother coming back at all. Was that a threat or a promise? I stared at the words, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Fear, yes, the thought of truly being on my own was daunting. But also, relief. The thought of never having to go back, never having to endure another snide comment or backhanded compliment, never having to see the disappointment in Tom's eyes when I failed to live up to his impossible standards, it was liberating. I turned off the phone, cutting off the stream of messages. They could wait. Right now, I needed to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. I got out of the car, grabbing the small overnight bag I always kept in the trunk. It wasn't much, just a change of clothes and some basic toiletries, but it would do for now. As I walked towards the motel office, I felt a sense of unreality wash over me. Was I really doing this? Walking away from my life, my marriage, everything I'd known for the past 5 years. The motel clerk barely looked up as I checked in, sliding a key across the scratched Formica counter. I made my way to the room, each step feeling both terrifying and exhilarating. The room itself was basic, a bed, a small desk, a TV that had seen better days. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was mine. A space where I could think, where I could breathe, where I could start to figure out who I was without the constant criticism and belittlement. I sat on the edge of the bed, my overnight bag beside me. The events of the evening played through my mind on repeat, the maid's uniform, the laughter, Tom's smirking face. But now, removed from the immediate situation, I could see it all more clearly. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about years of small cruelties, of being made to feel less than, of having my self-worth slowly eroded. I thought about the woman I'd been when I first met Tom, confident, ambitious, full of dreams. Where had she gone? I'd let her be buried under years of criticism and doubt, let myself be molded into what Tom and his family wanted me to be. Or rather, what they believed I could never be. As I sat there in that quiet motel room, I made a decision. I wasn't going back. Not tonight, not ever. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew it had to be better than what I was leaving behind. I would find a way to make it on my own, to rediscover the woman I'd once been and become someone even stronger. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of possibility. Yes, I was scared. Yes, the road ahead would be difficult. But I was free. Free to make my own choices, to live my own life, to be my own person. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the door I'd closed behind me when I left Tom's house. It was more than just a physical door, it was the door to my old life, to the person I'd been molded into being. And as I closed my eyes, I knew with certainty that it was a door I would never reopen. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. I would need to find a more permanent place to stay, figure out how to support myself, begin the process of disentangling my life from Tom's. But those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, in this small, unremarkable motel room, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The woman who had walked out of that house was not the same one who now lay in this motel bed. She was stronger, more determined, and finally free. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The door to my old life was closed, and I had no intention of ever opening it again. The harsh light of morning filtered through the thin curtains of my motel room, rousing me from a fitful sleep. For a moment, disorientation clouded my mind. Where was I? Then, like a flood, the events of the previous night came rushing back. The Christmas party, the maid's uniform, my hasty departure, it all seemed like a surreal dream. I sat up slowly, taking in my surroundings. The small, nondescript room was a far cry from the comfortable bedroom I'd grown accustomed to, but it represented something far more valuable: freedom. As I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my foot nudged the overnight bag I'd brought with me. It was a stark reminder of how little I had brought into this new chapter of my life. My phone lay on the nightstand where I'd left it, still turned off. With a deep breath, I switched it on, bracing myself for the barrage of notifications I knew would be waiting. As expected, there were dozens of missed calls and messages, mostly from Tom, but also from Evelyn and a few of Tom's siblings. I scrolled through them, my heart racing. The messages from Tom started off angry, demanding to know where I was and ordering me to come home. As the night progressed, they became more threatening. "If you don't come back right now, don't bother coming back at all," one read. The most recent ones, however, had a different tone. "Sarah, please. Where are you? Are you safe? We're worried." I almost laughed at that last one. Worried? They hadn't been worried about my feelings when they were laughing at me, humiliating me with that maid's uniform. No, this wasn't concern for my well-being. This was concern for their own comfort, their own routines. They were realizing that their punching bag had walked out, and they didn't know how to handle it. Evelyn's messages were predictably condescending. "Sarah, dear, you're being terribly dramatic. It was just a bit of fun. Come home and we'll sort this out." The thought of going back, of facing their smug faces and insincere apologies, made my stomach churn. I turned the phone off again, unable to bear any more of their messages. As I did so, I caught sight of the time. It was later than I'd realized, almost noon. I'd slept for hours, the emotional exhaustion of the previous night finally catching up with me. With a sigh, I stood up and made my way to the small bathroom. The face that looked back at me from the mirror was pale and drawn, dark circles under my eyes testament to the stress of the past 24 hours. But there was something else there too, a glimmer of determination that I hadn't seen in years. As I went through the motions of getting ready for the day, showering, dressing in the spare clothes from my overnight bag, my mind was racing. What now? Where would I go from here? The enormity of what I'd done was starting to sink in. I'd walked out on my marriage, on the life I'd known for the past 5 years. It was terrifying, but also strangely exhilarating. I needed a plan. I couldn't stay in this motel forever, and the money in my personal account wouldn't last long. I needed a job, a place to live, a way to support myself. The thought was daunting. I hadn't worked since marrying Tom, his insistence that I didn't need to work gradually eroding my confidence in my own abilities. As I contemplated my next move, my stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the previous evening. There was a small diner attached to the motel, not exactly gourmet cuisine, but it would do. I gathered my few belongings, checked out of the room, and made my way there. The diner was nearly empty, just a few patrons scattered at the formica tables. I slid into a booth near the back, gratefully accepting the steaming cup of coffee the waitress brought over. As I sipped the bitter brew, I pulled out a small notepad from my bag. It was time to make a plan. First things first, I needed a job. Something that could provide immediate income while I figured out my next steps. I jotted down a few possibilities: retail, waitressing, temp work. Nothing glamorous, but they were jobs that could hire quickly and provide a steady paycheck. Next, housing. The motel was fine for a night or two, but I needed something more permanent. I made a note to look into short-term rentals or extended stay hotels. It wouldn't be home, but it would be a roof over my head while I got back on my feet. As I worked through my list, adding items like open new bank account and look into divorce lawyers, I felt a curious mix of fear and excitement. This wasn't how I'd imagined spending the day after Christmas, but there was something empowering about taking control of my life like this. The waitress returned to take my order, and as I glanced up at her, an idea struck me. "Excuse me," I said, "are you hiring by any chance?" She looked surprised by the question, but nodded. "Actually, yeah. We're short-staffed, especially for the night shift. You interested?" I hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Yes, I am. Very interested." She smiled, pulling out an application from her apron pocket. "Fill this out and I'll make sure the manager sees it. Fair warning though, it's hard work and the pay isn't great." I took the application, feeling a small surge of hope. That's okay. I'm not afraid of hard work. As I filled out the application, I realized how much of my identity had been tied up in being Tom's wife. In the blank for previous employment, I had to reach back to the jobs I'd held before getting married. It was a stark reminder of how much I'd let my own ambitions and independence slip away over the years. But as I wrote, I also remembered the skills I'd had, the goals I'd once pursued. I'd been a hard worker, ambitious, with dreams of starting my own business one day. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had been buried under the weight of Tom's expectations and his family's constant criticism. But they weren't gone, just dormant, waiting to be awakened. I handed the completed application back to the waitress, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A first step towards reclaiming my independence. As I finished my meal, I pulled out my phone again, this time to search for nearby extended stay hotels. I found one not too far away that seemed affordable, at least for the short term. It would be a step up from the motel, giving me a bit more stability while I figured out my next moves. With a plan starting to take shape, I felt some of the panic and uncertainty of the past 24 hours begin to subside. I wasn't naive, I knew the road ahead would be difficult. Rebuilding a life from scratch at 30 wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. As I left the diner, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me seemed different from the one who had fled her husband's house the night before. There was a spark in her eye, a set to her jaw that spoke of determination. She looked like someone who was down but not out, someone who was ready to fight for herself. I made my way to my car, my mind already on the next steps of my plan. Find the extended stay hotel. Look for more job opportunities. Start researching divorce proceedings. Each item on my mental checklist was another brick in the foundation of my new life. As I drove away from the motel, I allowed myself a small smile. It wasn't much of a plan yet, more of a rough sketch really. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I was making decisions for myself, charting my own course. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibilities. The maid's uniform that had been meant to humiliate me had instead become the catalyst for my liberation. In trying to break my spirit, Tom and his family had inadvertently set me free. They'd given me a maid's uniform, intending it as a symbol of subservience. Instead, I was going to turn it into armor, a reminder of what I'd overcome and the strength I'd found within myself. As I merged onto the highway, heading towards my next temporary home, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Yes, I was scared. Yes, the road ahead would be challenging. But I was also excited, energized by the possibilities that lay before me. A plan was born, and with it, a new version of myself was emerging. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The future was mine to shape, and I was ready for the challenge. The weeks following my departure from Tom's house blurred together in a whirlwind of activity. The extended stay hotel became my temporary home, a small, impersonal space that nonetheless represented my first steps towards independence. It wasn't much, but it was mine, free from the suffocating presence of Tom and his family. My first week was a crash course in adulting all over again. I opened a new bank account, redirecting what little savings I had away from the joint account I'd shared with Tom. I spent hours on the phone, canceling shared credit cards and untangling our intertwined finances. Each call, each signature on a new form, felt like severing another tie to my old life. The diner job came through, much to my relief. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay meager, but it was a start. I found myself assigned to the night shift, a blessing in disguise. The quiet hours of the early morning gave me time to think, to plan, to dream of what my future could be. As I poured coffee for truckers and served plates of eggs to night owls, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd forgotten. The easy rapport I built with regular customers reminded me of my old social skills, long buried under years of isolation in Tom's world. The ability to juggle multiple orders and keep cool under pressure awakened a confidence I thought I'd lost. But the diner job was just a stepping stone. In the hours between shifts, I scoured job listings, updated my long-neglected resume, and started to explore opportunities that aligned more closely with my old ambitions. It was during one of these late-night job searches that I stumbled upon an advertisement for night classes at a local community college. The course catalog beckoned to me like a lifeline. Business management, marketing, computer skills, all the things I'd once dreamed of studying before marriage had derailed my plans. The tuition fees made me wince, but a voice in my head, one that sounded suspiciously like the old, confident me, whispered that it would be worth it. I enrolled in 2 classes to start, Introduction to Business Management and Digital Marketing Basics. The first night I walked into the classroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror, I felt like an imposter. Surrounded by students, some younger, some older, all seemingly more confident than me, I almost turned around and walked out. But I didn't. I took a deep breath, found a seat, and opened my notebook. As the professor began to speak, I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine intellectual curiosity. I scribbled notes furiously, asked questions, engaged in discussions. For the first time in a long time, I felt my mind stretching, growing, awakening. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, I began to see changes in myself. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror each morning stood a little straighter, held her head a little higher. The dark circles under my eyes, testament to long nights of study and early mornings at the diner, were badges of honor rather than signs of defeat. My phone, once flooded with messages from Tom and his family, grew quieter. Tom's messages had evolved from angry demands to return, to pleading apologies, to finally, terse updates about divorce proceedings. Each message stung, reopening wounds that were still fresh, but each one also reaffirmed my decision to leave. Evelyn, true to form, couldn't resist periodically reminding me of what I'd thrown away. Her messages were a mixture of faux concern and thinly veiled insults. "I do hope you're managing on your own, dear. It must be so hard for you without Tom to take care of you." Each one made me grit my teeth, but also strengthened my resolve. I was managing, and I was doing it without them. As spring bloomed in Boston, bringing with it a sense of renewal, I felt myself blooming too. My grades in my night classes were excellent, earning praise from my professors. At the diner, I'd been promoted to shift supervisor, a small step up but one that came with a welcome boost to my paycheck. It was around this time that I decided to take another leap. A small, independently owned cafe near my night school was hiring. The owner, a warm, grandmotherly woman named Rose, took one look at my resume and my eagerness and decided to give me a chance. The cafe job was a step up from the diner, better hours, slightly better pay, and most importantly, a more positive environment. Rose became something of a mentor to me. She'd started the cafe in her 50s after a divorce, building it from nothing into a thriving local business. Her story inspired me, showing me that it was never too late to start over. Under her guidance, I learned not just about making the perfect latte, but about running a small business, managing finances, and building customer relationships. My world, which had shrunk to the suffocating confines of Tom's expectations, began to expand. I made friends among my classmates and co-workers. We'd grab drinks after class or work, sharing stories and dreams. For the first time in years, I was building relationships that were truly mine, not extensions of Tom's social circle. Weekends, once filled with obligatory family dinners and social events I dreaded, became opportunities for self-discovery. I explored Boston with new eyes, visiting museums I'd always wanted to see but had never made time for. I joined a yoga class, rediscovering the joy of movement and the peace of mindfulness. I even started volunteering at a local women's shelter, finding healing in helping others who were on similar journeys of recovery and self-discovery. As summer approached, I faced a new challenge, finding a more permanent place to live. The extended stay hotel had served its purpose, but it was time to find a real home. With my improved financial situation, thanks to careful budgeting, my 2 jobs, and the remainder of my savings, I was able to rent a small studio apartment. The day I moved in was a milestone. The space was tiny, the furniture second-hand, but it was mine. As I arranged my few possessions and pinned my class schedule to the fridge, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in years. This little apartment represented so much more than just a place to live. It was tangible proof of my independence, my resilience, my ability to stand on my own 2 feet. That night, sitting on my second-hand couch with a cup of tea, I allowed myself to really reflect on how far I'd come. Just months ago, I'd been a shell of myself, beaten down by years of subtle abuse and belittlement. Now, I was standing on my own, building a life that was truly mine. I thought about the Maid's uniform, still stuffed in the back of my closet. I'd kept it, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of how far I'd come. They'd tried to define me, to confine me to a role of servitude and inferiority. Instead, their cruelty had become the catalyst for my rebirth. As I drifted off to sleep that night in my new home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still long, and I knew there would be more challenges to face. The divorce proceedings were ongoing, a constant reminder of the life I'd left behind. There were still moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering if I'd made the right choice. But with each passing day, those moments grew fewer and farther between. The woman who had walked out of Tom's house on Christmas Eve was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more alive. I was rising from the ashes of my old life, building something new and beautiful from the ruins. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to grow and learn. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited to face them. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms. As the crisp air of December settled over Boston once again, I found myself marveling at how much could change in a year. The woman who had fled her husband's house last Christmas Eve was almost unrecognizable to me now. In her place stood someone stronger, more confident, and infinitely more alive. The past year had been a whirlwind of growth and change. My night classes had evolved into a full-time business program at the local community college, where I was excelling beyond my wildest expectations. The cafe job had turned into a management position, with Rose taking me under her wing and teaching me the ins and outs of running a successful small business. But perhaps the most significant change was the small consulting business I had started on the side. It had begun almost by accident. Helping out a classmate with their marketing strategy for a school project had led to referrals, which led to more clients. What had started as a hobby was slowly but surely turning into a viable business. It was this fledgling business that had led to the invitation sitting on my desk, an opportunity to speak at a local event aimed at empowering women in business. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I could barely speak up for myself. Now, I was being asked to share my story and insights with others. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my blazer and taking a deep breath, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The pain, the struggles, the moments of doubt, they had all shaped me, forged me into the woman I was today. The event was being held in a sleek conference center downtown. As I walked into the lobby, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves, I was struck by the energy in the room. Women of all ages and backgrounds milled about, chatting animatedly, their faces alight with ambition and determination. I made my way to the green room, where I was greeted by the event organizer, a dynamic woman named Jen. "Sarah, we're so excited to have you here," she said, shaking my hand warmly. "Your story is exactly what our attendees need to hear." As I waited for my turn to speak, I ran through my notes one last time. My talk wasn't perfectly polished, I was still new to public speaking, but it was authentic. I planned to share my journey, the lessons I'd learned, and the strategies I'd developed for building confidence and resilience in the face of adversity. Finally, it was time. As I walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding me, I took a deep breath. I looked out at the sea of faces, all turned expectantly towards me, and began to speak. A year ago, I started, my voice steadier than I felt. I was a different person. I was trapped in a life that wasn't my own, defined by others' expectations and limitations. Today, I stand before you as proof that it's never too late to rewrite your story. As I spoke, sharing the highs and lows of my journey, I could feel the audience connecting with my words. I saw nods of understanding, heard murmurs of agreement. When I described the incident with the maid's uniform, the catalyst for my departure, I heard gasps of shock and outrage. "That uniform was meant to humiliate me, to put me in my place," I said. Instead, it became the spark that ignited my transformation. It reminded me of who I didn't want to be, and pushed me to rediscover who I truly was. I went on to talk about the practical steps I'd taken, the night classes, the jobs, the gradual rebuilding of my confidence and skills. I shared the strategies I'd developed for overcoming self-doubt and fear, for pushing through the hard days when giving up seemed like the easiest option. As I neared the end of my talk, I looked out at the audience once more. "The road hasn't been easy," I admitted. "There were days when I wanted to give up, to go back to what was familiar, even if it was painful. But each small victory, each step forward, gave me the strength to keep going. And standing here today, I can tell you it was worth every moment of struggle." The applause that followed as I finished speaking was thunderous. Women stood up, clapping and cheering. Some were wiping away tears. As I made my way off the stage, my heart soaring with a mixture of relief and elation, I was surrounded by attendees wanting to share their own stories or thank me for sharing mine. It was as I was making my way through this crowd, still riding the high of the moment, that I saw him. Tom. My ex-husband, standing at the back of the room, his face a mask of shock and something else I couldn't quite identify. For a moment, I froze. A year's worth of emotions, anger, hurt, fear, welled up inside me. But then, almost as quickly, they subsided. I realized that seeing him didn't have the power to shake me anymore. I was no longer the woman who had fled his house in tears a year ago. Excusing myself from the group of women I'd been talking to, I made my way towards him. As I approached, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face, as if he wasn't sure whether to stay or flee. "Tom," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I didn't expect to see you here." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. I didn't know you'd be speaking, he said finally. I'm here for work. We're sponsoring the event. I nodded, unsurprised. His company had always been big on public relations gestures like this. Well, it's an important event, I said. These women have amazing stories and ambitions. An awkward silence fell between us. I could see Tom struggling to reconcile the confident woman standing before him with the wife he'd known, or thought he'd known. You've changed, he said finally, stating the obvious. I met his gaze evenly. No, Tom. I became who I always should have been. Who I always was, underneath all the criticism and control. He flinched slightly at my words, but didn't argue. Instead, he asked, Are you happy? The question took me by surprise. In all our years together, I couldn't remember Tom ever asking me that. I took a moment to consider my answer. Yes, I said finally. I am. It hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of what I've accomplished. I'm excited about my future in a way I haven't been in years. Tom nodded slowly, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. I'm glad, he said, and to my surprise, he seemed to mean it. I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't realize. He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. I felt a sudden wave of pity for him. The man standing before me seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than the husband I'd once tiptoed around. Thank you, I said simply. I hope you're doing well, Tom. Before he could respond, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Jen, the event organizer. Sarah, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there are some people who'd like to speak with you about potential consulting opportunities. I nodded, turning back to Tom. I have to go. Take care of yourself, Tom. As I walked away, I felt a profound sense of closure. The last lingering threads tying me to my old life had been severed. I was free, truly free, to move forward without the weight of the past holding me back. The rest of the event passed in a blur of conversations, connections, and opportunities. By the time I left the conference center, my head was spinning with potential new clients and collaborations. The future stretched out before me, bright with possibility. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the unlikely reunion with Tom. A year ago, the sight of him would have reduced me to a nervous, apologetic wreck. Today, I had stood my ground, confident in who I was and what I had achieved. The woman who had received a maid's uniform as a cruel joke last Christmas had risen from those ashes. She had turned that symbol of servitude into fuel for her transformation. And now, she was helping other women rise and reclaim their own power. As I pulled up to my apartment building, a new, nicer place I'd moved into a few months ago, I smiled to myself. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more growth, more transformations ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited to face them. The future was mine to shape, and I couldn't wait to see what it held. The months following the Women's Empowerment event were a whirlwind of activity and growth. My small consulting business had taken off, fueled by the connections I'd made at the conference and the positive word of mouth from satisfied clients. I found myself working longer hours, but the work was fulfilling in a way I'd never experienced before. Each successful project, each client's grateful smile, felt like another step away from the woman I'd once been and towards the person I was meant to be. As spring bloomed in Boston, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility, I decided to take another leap. With my business growing, I needed more space, both literally and figuratively. I began looking for a small office to rent, a place where I could meet clients and really establish my brand. It was during this search that I received an unexpected message. My phone buzzed one afternoon as I was leaving a potential office space, and I nearly dropped it when I saw the name on the screen, Evelyn. My former mother-in-law, the woman who had handed me that mocking maid's uniform over a year ago. For a moment, I considered ignoring the message. The thought of engaging with Evelyn, of reopening old wounds, made my stomach churn. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the text. Sarah, I hope this message finds you well. I understand if you don't wish to respond, but I was hoping we might be able to meet. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you. Evelyn, the tone was uncharacteristically polite, almost desperate. It was so unlike the Evelyn I knew that I found myself intrigued despite my better judgment. After a few days of deliberation, I replied, agreeing to meet her at a neutral location, a cafe in the city center. As I walked into the cafe on the agreed day, my heart was pounding. I spotted Evelyn immediately, sitting at a corner table, her usual immaculate appearance somewhat dimmed. She looked older, more tired than I remembered. "Sarah," she said as I approached, rising to greet me. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I took a seat across from her, studying her face. The smug superiority I was used to seeing was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "I'll admit, I was surprised to hear from you," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What did you want to discuss?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. "It's about the family business," she said. We're in trouble, Sarah. The company is struggling, and we're at risk of losing everything." I listened in silence as she explained the situation. Poor management decisions, changing market conditions, and a series of bad investments had left the once thriving family business on the brink of collapse. As she spoke, I could see the fear in her eyes, fear of losing not just their wealth, but their identity, their place in the world. "We've tried everything," Evelyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Consultants, restructuring, but nothing seems to work. And then I saw you speak at that event. I saw what you've accomplished, the business you've built. And I thought, I hoped." She trailed off, unable to bring herself to ask directly for my help. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once handed me a maid's uniform, who had treated me like a servant in her home, was now essentially begging for my assistance. Part of me, I'll admit, felt a surge of vindictive pleasure. Here was my chance for revenge, to turn my back on them as they had turned their backs on me. But as I looked at Evelyn, seeing the desperation in her eyes, I felt something else, compassion, mixed with a sense of my own strength. "Evelyn," I said slowly, "what happened between us, between me and your family, it can't be undone. The way you treated me, the things you said and did, they caused real harm." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know," she said softly. "And I'm truly sorry, Sarah. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am sorry." I took a deep breath, considering my next words carefully. "I appreciate your apology," I said. "And while I can't forget what happened, I'm not the same person I was back then. I've grown, I've changed. And part of that change is knowing that I don't need to hold on to anger or seek revenge to prove my worth." Evelyn looked up, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Does that mean?" "It means I'm willing to look at your business situation," I said. "I can't promise anything, but I'll review your financials and operations, and see if there's anything I can suggest to help turn things around." The relief on Evelyn's face was palpable. "Thank you, Sarah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it." Over the next few weeks, I dove deep into the family business's financials and operations. It was challenging work, requiring long hours and all the skills I'd developed over the past year. But it was also oddly satisfying, using my hard-earned expertise to potentially save the very business that had once been used to belittle me. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. The maid's uniform that had been meant to humiliate me had instead become the catalyst for my transformation. It had pushed me to rediscover my strength, my ambition, my sense of self-worth. And now, here I was, using the skills I'd developed to help the very people who had once sought to tear me down. After weeks of analysis and planning, I presented my findings and recommendations to Evelyn and the rest of the family, including Tom. The conference room was tense as I walked them through my presentation, outlining the issues I'd identified and my proposed solutions. "The business is salvageable," I concluded, "but it will require significant changes. You'll need to streamline operations, pivot your marketing strategy, and possibly consider bringing in outside investment. It won't be easy, but if you're willing to put in the work, I believe you can turn things around." As I finished speaking, the room was silent. I could see the weight of my words settling on each of them, the realization of how much needed to change, but also the hope that all was not lost. It was Tom who spoke first. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and regret, "this is incredible. The work you've done, the insights you've provided. I don't know how to thank you." I met his gaze steadily. "You don't need to thank me, Tom. I didn't do this for gratitude or forgiveness. I did it because I could, because I have the skills and knowledge to help. And because doing so was my choice, not an obligation, not a duty, but a decision I made freely." Evelyn stood up then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Sarah," she said, her voice wavering, "I owe you an apology. Not just for asking for your help, but for everything. The way we treated you, the things we said and did, we were wrong. So terribly wrong." I nodded, acknowledging her words. "Thank you, Evelyn. Your apology means a lot. But more than that, I hope this experience has taught you something. About judging people, about the danger of thinking you're superior to others. Because life has a way of turning the tables when you least expect it." As I gathered my things to leave, I felt a profound sense of closure. I had faced my past, confronted the people who had once made me feel small and insignificant, and I had done so on my own terms. I had chosen to help not out of obligation or a desire for revenge, but from a place of strength and compassion. Walking out of the office building and into the bright spring sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in years. The last vestiges of the old Sarah, the one who had been cowed by their judgments and diminished by their expectations, fell away. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who had faced her fears and emerged stronger for it. As I made my way back to my own office, the lease signed just days before, I couldn't help but smile. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led me here, to a place of confidence, of purpose, of true independence. The maid's uniform that had once symbolized my subservience now represented something entirely different. It was a reminder of how far I'd come, of the strength I'd found within myself. They had given me a maid's uniform, intending it as a tool of humiliation. Instead, I had turned it into armor, a symbol of my resilience and growth. In the end, the greatest justice wasn't in seeing them struggle or in having them need my help. It was in the knowledge that I had risen above their attempts to define and limit me. I had written my own story, on my own terms. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that the best chapters were still to come.